Welcome to another edition of Around with Randall, your weekly podcast on making your nonprofit more effective for your community. And here is your host, the CEO and founder of Hallett Philanthropy, Randall Hallett.
It's another fabulous day right here on this edition of Around with Randall. As we begin to move into 2026, and some of the things that we've talked about over the last two or three of the episodes, particularly with the Prediction Show in episode 262 for the year, this means a moment where nonprofits and philanthropy is going to have to deal with adversity. That's what I want to talk about today. Maybe not the tactical things that are going to be applicable in terms of, hey, we're going to execute this major gift plan or this annual giving plan or plan giving effort, but about how your organization and you can deal with adversity. Back on episode 67, I dealt with it from a little bit different perspective. This time I want to deal with it from the standpoint of the things that your organization can do as it maybe works through some bumps in the road, challenges that are really part of the cycle that I'm seeing more and more with the nonprofits I have the privilege of working with. I want to start with where this all stemmed from. Received an email from Jordan in Denver asking, listener, which I appreciate anyone who listens, my one listener, I guess. But Jordan asked the question that I always end with the same saying, and why? And that saying is, you'll hear it once here and then maybe once at the end, the old Gaelic one. Some people make things happen. Some people watch things happen. Then there are those who wondered what happened. His question was, where did that come from? And literally 2 days later, one of my dearest friends in the world, someone that I trust implicitly, used the name of the person that I first heard it from 25 years ago, which brings me to kind of piecing together. I'm not sure it's providential, but at least some signs that we're going to talk about this. I first heard of the old Gaelic saying from a hero of mine. Not quite to the level of my father by any stretch, the only man I really ever wanted to be, but in terms of someone that was in the outside world, somebody I looked up to, someone like an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington, as I've read about them. This individual's name was Jim Lovell. Some may know, some may not. But Jim Lovell was a United States NASA astronaut, and most famously was the commander of the Apollo 13 mission, the role that Tom Hanks played in the movie, that famously had the explosion in space on its way to the moon and had to circle the moon and come back. I heard Jim Lovell at a conference once speak, and he certainly didn't use the saying as much as I do, but he mentioned it. And that in his mind, that when we work into or have thrust upon us adversity, we have choices. And he wasn't speaking about, and the Gaelic saying doesn't reflect, the choices of, well, if we do A, we do B, we do C, to paraphrase, and we're going to steal from a space metaphor kind of episode here, The Martian, where we have the conversation around, which was Ridley Scott's great movie, around the thought process, as was said at the very end of the movie, you do one, you do two, you do three. What Jim Lovell was talking about was more of a psychological. Some people make things happen, watch things happen, then there are those who wonder what happened, is do you choose to act? Do you just sit back and watch? Do you not care? That there are makers, watchers, and wanderers. And that when adversity hits, the true choice, at least the first of many choices, is to choose to do something about it. Not to accept that there is a chance, and maybe with the right plan, a plausibility, that we can make this scenario better. On top of all of this, if you know me personally, you would be aware of this. I recently went through my second knee replacement in 6 months. Between football and athletics and life, I needed 2 knee replacements. There's very much this Gaelic saying in my recovery, in both, but more particularly in the second. In that I lost mobility, I lost independence. Basically, my wife had to adopt a third child. That's referring to me because I'm in a recliner. I can't feed myself for the most part. It's just challenging to get up, go to the bathroom, let alone to actually do anything. My kids are running and getting ice for the machine. It's an unglamorous, slow recovery. Now, fortunately, in both cases, I'm incredibly blessed to have an amazing surgeon and a phenomenal physical therapist, and was brought up to believe that these people are experts and I should do what they tell me. So I've done exactly that. But what I've realized when you put all of this together is that the adversity that I felt was twofold. It was a choice of doing something, watching something, or just wondering. And I wasn't going to sit and watch or wonder. I had to do my exercise. I had to go to physical therapy. I had to choose to engage. Discomfort, pain, a realization that progress comes in inches, not in milestones, that there's frustration, that there's setbacks, that it's not a linear progression, that all of this also moves into not only the physical, but the mental and the emotional. We happen to do the second one over the holidays, and there I am at, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. I can't help my wife with anything, with presents, with food, she's left holding everything. That's an emotional guilt. And if you don't think I bought my wife's love this Christmas, which is a terrible phrase and saying, you don't understand that, you don't understand me. I owe my family, my mother, my sisters who called and were showing up, and certainly my kids and my wife, an immense amount. Adversity comes in many different forms. For me, recently, it was this dealing with the knee, and I'm progressing through it. If you go back and listen to episode 160 or 262, excuse me, of the predictions for 2026, I hit upon some of the things I think are going to happen. And I've been very lucky to be running at 80% or higher when I make these predictions at the beginning of the next, or in beginning into the next year. We're going to be dealing with things like leadership transition. I'm watching, and it's not mentioned in that particular podcast, but man, are we seeing a lot of turnover. We're dealing with donor fatigue and certainly the uncertainty of where we are in the 95, 97, 95.5, 97.3 world where fewer people are making a bigger difference. We're having staffing gaps because of budget issues and certainly burnout. And we also probably don't have the talent set we need to replace those that are retiring after years of dedication and leadership. Technology and AI pressures, things are changing quickly. We also know that there's revenue volatility that we're having if you're in healthcare or education, kind of two of the bigger areas, but certainly I'd throw in the religious sector of the nonprofit world, changes in this volatility as we are in kind of an economic uncertainty. I keep talking about this K economy recovery or K economy. Those who have resources are doing fairly well. The markets are really up. People at the top end are doing okay. The problem is, like the K breaks up and down, we have a lot of people that are really struggling with inflation. And the numbers, some months look pretty good, generically, or in terms of across the country. Some months they look bad, and I don't think anybody's got a real finger on what's going on. Then we have this continuation of reduction of donors in our annual giving cycles, and what I'm noticing more and more often, we'll talk about this in the tactical here in a moment about how do we get some positive direction, is that we have kind of a lack of strategy amongst a lot of boards and leaders. We're like the little boy in the dike plugging holes instead of figuring out how do we rebuild the wall and maybe make it look different to last longer. That the nonprofit equivalence of my recovery or injury or surgery is that doing things right takes time. It doesn't come quickly, and that there's a frustration or a impatience that comes, and that capacity or the need for it can be a constraint because we may not have it. It may mean that we have to look at other options. I also think it's important to realize that when we deal with adversity as an organization is that transitioning or treating this moment as transition and looking at it as a temporary inconvenience is terribly defeating to what we need to accomplish, because it may mean we need to look at structural change to be who and what we want to be. We'll talk about that in the tactical outcomes as well. All this to say is that this may not be a pause, adversity that we're sensing of all the things I just labeled, no different than my knee. It's a pivot point. I may not be able to, and at 55, I'm not assuming I'll be able to run like an 18-year-old, But I may not be able to do the same things. But am I going to accept that or engage in ways in finding to do things I want to do in different ways? Am I going to stop coaching my kids' teams? Hell no. But I might have to do it differently, particularly in the short run, because it's challenging. Going to basketball games with my son, or going up to watch the high school team, or watching my kids play, or taking walks with my wife. It may be a little different, but I'm not giving up on what I love. The same is true of our nonprofits. That this isn't not a pause, but a pivot. And can we pivot to what's right? Which brings us to our tactical. The rest of the time today, as I do every episode, I want to talk about 6 things that we can do as organizations. And you can parlay this into individual if you want. I think there's probably a lot of carryover and connection into tactile things that make it better. 6. So let's start at the top. Number 1 is to be honest and name the reality early. Too often organizations put their head in the sand and they avoid the realization, or at least the recognition, that there's a problem. The longer you wait, the more challenging it becomes. I have a client who I'm working with, very interesting in some way in my past, dealt with admissions. And they asked, because I'd done some other work with them, could I help them with some admissions? And I ran this incredible, it was so much fun, which says a lot about me, data analysis of all of their students' enrollment figures over the last 5 years and what's going on, and then overlay that with finance and what they're doing. And what I came out in the report, it was to say that you have these 7 options today. If you wait 18 months, you're going to have 4 options. And if you wait 3 years, you may only have 1 or 2. If you aren't willing to work into the problem and talk about it now in clear language, avoiding unrealistic optimism that will destroy, by the way, when people sense it, trust internally and externally, to be realistic so there's no surprises, to deal with the situation, the more options you have, and you'll hear this throughout, I believe, and this is something I do when I mentor, coach, or just deal with as many people as I can who ask my advice. They must be crazy to do so, but they seem to do it a lot. I always talk about options. How do you create options for yourself? Because the more options you have, the better choice you'll make. If you only have one option, there is no choice. So the first thing is to be honest and be looking at the situation in a real sense of calmness, but a sense of reality, and be open to it. Number 2 is to separate the idea of effort with effectiveness. What do I mean by that? That when we have adversity, sometimes it's not okay just to say, well, I'm working really hard at it, instead of creating measurable ways to find out if we're adjusting to what the situation demands. John Wooden, one of my all-time favorites, one of those, I talked about it, from a gym level perspective, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. John Wooden's another one of my favorite kind of non-personal heroes, somebody I read about and looked up to in terms of what he did in his life. The all-time NCAA winningest championship coach at UCLA, winning 10 of 11 championships from 1964 to 1975. One of the things he had was his pyramid of success. And one of the things in that pyramid of success, and if you've heard me speak before, you probably have heard me say this, he said, don't confuse activity with accomplishment or achievement. Just because we're doing something doesn't mean it's actually the right thing to do, nor is it okay to say, well, we're working really hard at it without having achievement. Activity is not the same thing as impact. So that means we have to stop measuring busyness and start measuring traction. Meaning, are we moving towards what we need to do? Which can be painful, because when we measure busyness, what we get is a lot less friction, particularly if the busyness actually isn't leading to any change or adjustment. Growth, positive outcomes comes from discomfort, which means we need to find ways of measuring it. Going all the way back to my knee, I know when I'm doing the right things, because when I come home from physical therapy, or at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, when I do my exercises, and there's a slight bit of discomfort in my legs, the right kind of discomfort, it tells me I'm doing the right things. And surprisingly, 2 or 3 days later, there seems to be less of it. We have to be willing to be effective, not just measure effort. 3 is shorten the planning horizon. And I'm going to use number 6 as dealing with strategy. But here I want to talk for just a minute about that. Depending on the level of adversity will really predict and or drive the amount of time that you need to create clarity. If it's an immense emergency, it's 20, 30 days max, maybe 10, because we got to make huge adjustments. If it's something we see far enough ahead, we're willing to do number one, admit that reality, then we may have more time, which means we have the option of maybe looking at 90 to 120 days. Or if we need to make changes over several, let's say 2 years, it may be a series of steps. But here are the questions to ask to figure out where you're at and how much time you have. What is it we must stable and how critical is it? What can wait that we're currently doing that may not be? And I just had this conversation with a client yesterday where I literally was like, we're doing this. I said, you need to put these 3 things on hold, one of which was like an accounting issue. And I said, you have political issues you have to deal with to get through this challenge. That is not, I mean, it wasn't against FASB or GAP or, the Kubo. They just wanted to make, the CFO was like, well, this would be great. I'm like, yeah, but the CFO don't have to deal with the issue like the president would, like politically with the board. And why do these numbers look differently? So what can wait? What can we stop? So we can put our efforts into the things that need the most immediate attention. And then how destabilizing they are becomes the question of how long you have to deal with it. 10 days, 30 days, 90 days, 2 years. And by the way, you might have multiple plans in each one of those timeframes. So shorten your planning window to deal with what you have to deal with in the moment, or what the biggest piece of adversity is. And by the way, my knee, I stopped working for a month. If you know me at all, that's not easy. I like what I do. I hope I'm of value to my clients. I'm very lucky I don't do a lot of advertising. They seem to find me. And I love the privilege of serving them. Taking me out of that for a month is hard, but that needs to go because I got to worry about my knee and just functioning. 4, invest in recovery, not in performance. This is really dealing with our staffs, our most precious but limited resource, that we're going to need people to make change. So we have to find ways of creating what I would think of as pace. How do we do this meaningfully? And in doing so, do we need to bring in someone or do we need to make a change? I have a client who I'm dealing with who's making some changes in what they're trying to accomplish. And what we talked about was finding an interim person to be a kind of a high level leader, not necessarily the executive or CEO, but to oversee a department that is struggling because it wasn't going to happen unless they needed more talent. They needed, and it's an investment. Yes, it costs some money, but they're already seeing the ramifications or the positive outcomes of that. So the first is that normalizing pacing may mean, can we evaluate talent or bandwidth? The second thing is we don't want to force guilt. We've got to make these changes. If we don't, it's because you didn't work and we didn't. You can't force guilt, because what happens in guilt is you end up in a scenario where you end up pushing people out. They'll walk away from that. So invest in the recovery, meaning your people, the people that can make the change, and do so in the most positive way possible without any guilt about who needs to do what. Number 5 is to communicate more, not less. You have responsibilities as an organization. If you name the reality, if you talk about effectiveness, if you look at it in the short and long-term horizons, and you invest, you got to be honest and do not tolerate silence. You have to address exactly what needs to be done, how to do it, why it might. You have to be consistent and not look for perfection in that communication. In doing so, what you'll do is create trust. And at the end of the day, that trust will take you a long ways to people's willingness to adjust. The last, as I mentioned at the top, certainly you want to create a shortened planning horizon. But at some point, you're going to have to go back to strategy. I'm sensing so many boards and leaders are so operational. And I keep pushing, and I just did it great. It was so much fun strategic planning session where I'm lifting that board over the course of a few months in their planning sessions out of the operations where all of a sudden they were talking about what do we want to be in a year, 3 years, 5 years. Now, they didn't have any immediate adversity, but what they had was no plan about where they were going. Eventually, now they had issues, they dealt with them, they did it brilliantly, but they needed to make this pivot once those adversity issues were kind of dealt with to really begin a process of strategy. Is that eventually you're going to have to put that at the forefront. And the second part of it is to put all kinds of options that you may not think of. I have another client I'm dealing with on a strategic planning process where we were talking about, just the CEO and I, about their board and maybe not the strategy direction that everybody thinks they need to have, the board needs to have. And I threw out some suggestions. She says, "Oh my gosh, I mean, if we even brought that up in a meeting, they go crazy." I'm like, "Why? Is it against your mission?" Options are good. It doesn't mean they all need to be executed. But I do believe we have a responsibility when we are in these leadership positions to put as many options on the table that keep us moving in the direction of the mission. And even if it's not a popular option, that doesn't mean it's a bad option. It means it's worthy of a conversation. And it may be dismissed, and that's also okay. But if you limit your options, you limit the foresight that a leadership group can have, a board can have. And so facing strategy and doing so at some point and with lots of options is a positive when dealing with or coming out of adversity. So reality, being honest, separate effort, effort's different than effectiveness, that we want to shorten the horizon for the time frame we have for the immediacy, and the bigger the immediacy, the less time we have. And then number 6, building back into strategy eventually. We're going to invest in this recovery with people. We're not just performance, no guilt. We're going to bring in the right resources to be successful. And we're going to communicate more. We're going to be more open with donors, with the board, with staff, with anybody that'll listen to say, look, this is what we're doing and we're going to be okay, but we are going to look different. Adversity and adjustments are important because that's what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with adversity and we're not dealing with enough adjustment. I want to steal to conclude kind of the tactical, and then we'll let you go for the day. I want to steal from my father. Still miss him terribly, and the only man I ever wanted to be, and I learned more from him probably than any other person on earth. But my father learned as a military hero and an officer in war in Vietnam, and then teaching at West Point, that you always have a plan A, you have a plan B, you have a plan C, and you have a plan D. I'm 55 years old, and most days I got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and plan D. Now that may say a lot about me, but what it does is present me options. And when I face adversity, I'm always looking at how many different ways can I try to solve it. I take that mentality in today's podcast, but also into the work that I do as a leader. How do I help clients figure out how many options they have and maybe see options they don't necessarily see, even though they're more, on the ground. Sometimes it's can't see the forest through the trees. The point is, and give credit to Dad, is that all of these moments, choosing to engage in them, back to our Gaelic saying, it's a choice. You have the choice as a leader to engage in adversity. You also have an equal choice in to watch it happen, just sit back and wonder what's happening. I have found that in life, the greatest leaders have chosen to be people who do things, who are action-oriented. They don't do it autocratically. They don't do it without forethought. They don't do it without trying to figure out how do I get the smartest people around me to help me figure out what I need to do. But they don't sit back. And that's what our nonprofits are going to need as we kind of weather this interesting time. And hopefully today this helps you kind of figure that out and how to do that. Don't forget, check out the blogs at hallettphilanthropy.com, 2 per week in RSS feed right to you. If you're interested, you can reach out to me like Jordan did, a podcast at hallettphilanthropy.com. As mentioned, today was all about different ways of looking at the challenges we're dealing with, and there's enough of them. And what I'm hoping is that today in this podcast and kind of my 20-minute or so classroom per week, or if you work with me, that I'm helping you deal with the adversity, figuring out how to make it better, because our world needs nonprofit and philanthropy. It's the whole between corporate, which is interested only really in profit, and government, which isn't all that efficient. There's this gap in the middle. And nonprofit philanthropy work is right there That's what we're trying to do, to solve those problems. And internally, those are more societal or macro problems. The micro problems of our organizations need attention. And I'm hoping today you get a chance to kind of think about that and be someone, as I conclude, who's someone who makes things happen. Because the other two, watching what happened and wondering what happened, don't get you to solutions. I'd like to thank Jim Lovell 25 plus years ago when he said it, and it stuck with me, and now I use it all the time. I'd like to thank him for bringing it to me and maybe me sharing it with you. I'll look forward to seeing you the next time right back here on the next edition of Around with Randall. Don't forget, make it a great day.